storage room at the British Museum, beneath layers of catalogue documentation and archival foam, sits a clay tablet no larger than your hand. Its museum designation is K3375, excavated from the ruins of Nineveh in 1853 by Hormuzd-Razam. The tablet spent nearly 2 decades in storage before anyone attempted translation. When George Smith finally deciphered it in 1872, he discovered something that would send shockwaves through Victorian England. The tablet contained an account of a global flood nearly identical to the biblical story of Noah, but it was written over 1,000 years earlier, and it didn't just describe the flood from a distance. It described what happened during the 7 days and nights when the world drowned. Before we go further, if you're settling in to follow this story, whether you're lying in bed in Mumbai, driving through Nevada, or walking empty streets in Stockholm at 4 in the morning, leave a comment and tell me where you are. There's something powerful about knowing we're exploring this ancient catastrophe together, across continents and time zones. What Smith had discovered was the Gilgamesh flood narrative, but it was just one piece of a much older tradition. The oldest written account comes from Sumerian tablets dating back to around 2001, 100 years before the Common Era. The text is called the Eridu Genesis, and while only fragments survive, what remains is extraordinary. Not because it describes a flood, floods appear in mythologies worldwide, but because of how it describes the flood, with procedural specificity, with measurements, with timing, with details that read less like religious allegory and more like eyewitness documentation of something that actually happened. The story begins not with the flood itself, but with the decision to cause it. And that decision, according to the tablets, didn't come easily. It came after debate, after dissent, and after one god broke ranks to ensure that not everything would be lost when the waters came in the great city of Shuruppak, which archaeologists have confirmed existed and was destroyed by flooding around 2,900 years before the Common Era. There lived a king named Zeus. The Akkadian texts call him Atrahasis. The Babylonian version calls him Ut. The biblical tradition would later call him Noah, but the Sumerian account is the oldest, and in the Sumerian telling, Zeusudra is described not just as righteous, but as exceptionally wise, a priest devoted to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. The texts describe a crisis unfolding in the divine realm. Humanity had multiplied across the earth. Cities had grown large. Agricultural work continued day and night. The grinding of grain, the hammering of metal, the voices of thousands conducting daily life created what the texts call rigmu. The word translates as noise, clamor, uproar. And according to the Atrahasis Epic, which preserves the fullest account of this period, the noise had become unbearable to the gods, and the supreme god who governed the earth brought the matter before the divine council. The tablets record his complaint with startling directness. The noise of mankind has become too intense. I am losing sleep over their racket. This wasn't symbolic language about human sin or moral failing. It was a practical complaint about overpopulation and the disruption it caused. The council discussed solutions. They had tried plague. Humanity recovered. They had tried drought. Humanity adapted. They had tried famine. Humanity survived. Each time, the population rebounded within a generation. Finally, Enlil proposed the ultimate solution, a flood that would erase everything. The council debated. Some gods expressed hesitation, but eventually authority was granted. Instructions were given to Enki, who governed the subterranean waters called the Abzu, to release the abyss. The storm god would open the heavens. The earth would be caught between waters above and waters below, drowned completely. But Enki objected. The texts are explicit about this. This wasn't quiet disagreement. This was open defiance at the highest level of divine authority. Enki had designed humanity. He had mixed the clay with divine essence. He had solved the labor crisis that had nearly triggered civil war among the gods when the younger deities revolted against endless agricultural work. And now the council wanted to destroy his solution, his creation, because they found humans inconveniently noisy. Enki couldn't stop the flood. The decision had been made. The mechanisms were already in motion, but he could undermine it. The Eridu Genesis describes what happened next with careful attention to method. Enki approached a reed wall, not a person, but a wall. He spoke to the wall, revealing the god's plan within earshot of Ziusudra, who was on the other side. This wasn't accidental. This was calculated. Enki was technically obeying the council's command not to warn humanity directly, while completely subverting its intention. The text preserves his instructions. Ziusudra, standing near, pay attention to my words. A flood will sweep over the cities, the cult centers, to destroy the seed of mankind. This is the decision, the word of the assembly of the gods. Tear down your house. Build a boat. Abandon possessions. Save life. The boat you will build, its dimensions shall be equal. Its length and width shall be the same. These are engineering specifications. The Akkadian version elaborates. The boat should be constructed like the Abzu, the subterranean realm. It should be roofed over completely so that the sun cannot see inside. The walls should be thick. The frame should be strong. The structure should be sealed with bitumen inside and out to make it watertight. Specific measurements are given. The boat should be 10 dozen cubits in height, 10 dozen cubits in length and width. A perfect cube, mathematically stable, designed to float rather than sail, to survive rather than navigate. Ziusudra began construction immediately. The texts don't specify how long this took, but building a vessel of this size would require significant time and labor. The Gilgamesh version describes Ziusudra enlisting help from the community, offering payment in the form of food and beer. He gathered materials, cedar wood for the frame, bitumen for sealing, rope for binding. The structure rose in the center of Shuruppak while the city watched, probably with confusion, possibly with mockery. Why would anyone build a massive boat in the middle of a city far from navigable water? As construction continued, Ziusudra gathered animals. The texts specify pairs, male and female, of every living creature. They also specify that he brought his family, his wife, his sons, their wives, and according to some versions, craftsmen, people with skills necessary to rebuild civilization, farmers who understood planting cycles, smiths who knew how to work metal, weavers, potters, the practical knowledge, base needed to restart society. When the boat was complete, when the animals were loaded, when supplies of food and fresh water were secured, Ziusudra sealed the door. And then he waited. The texts describe a specific sign. When Shamash, the sun god, gives you a sign, when he says the sender of rain will send a rain of loaves in the evening and a rain of wheat in the morning, then enter the boat and seal the door. This happened. The sign came. Ziusudra entered. The door was sealed from outside by helpers who would not themselves survive. And then the sky changed. The Atrahasis Epic describes the beginning with vivid detail. The noise of the storm reached the heavens. No one could see anyone else. The people could not be recognized in the catastrophe. Even the gods were frightened by the flood. They withdrew. They went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs. They crouched by the outer wall. Notice what this says. The gods themselves were terrified. Whatever was happening exceeded even their expectations. They retreated from earth entirely, fleeing to the highest heaven where Anu, the Sky Father, resided. The mechanism of the flood involved two sources. The fountains of the abyss erupted from below. Enki, despite his warning to Ziusudra, was still bound by the council's command to release the subterranean waters. From beneath the earth, massive amounts of water burst forth. Simultaneously, the dikes of heaven opened. Not rain in any normal sense, but the collapse of the barrier that separated the waters above from the earth below. In ancient Near Eastern cosmology, the sky was conceived as a solid dome holding back primordial waters. When that barrier failed, those waters fell. The Gilgamesh version describes the storm's intensity. For 6 days and 7 nights, the wind blew. The flood and the tempest overwhelmed the land. When the 7th day arrived, the tempest, the flood, which had fought like an army, subsided in its onslaught. The sea grew quiet. The storm wind grew still. The flood ceased. 7 days. The number appears consistently across versions. Not 40 days and 40 nights, as the later biblical account would describe, but 7 days of complete inundation. A week during which the entire world, at least the entire world known to the Mesopotamians, vanished beneath churning water. Inside the boat, conditions must have been barely survivable. Complete darkness. The text specifies the boat was roofed so the sun couldn't see inside. No windows. No way to know what was happening outside. The sound would have been overwhelming. Water crashing against the hull. Animals crying out in terror. The structure creaking under pressure. The boats had no rudder, no sail, no means of steering. It simply floated, tossed by currents and waves, a sealed container tumbling through chaos. Meanwhile, outside, everything humanity had built was being erased. The cities with their temples and palaces and administrative buildings, gone. The irrigation canals that had taken generations to dig, buried under silt. The fields where barley grew, drowned. The roads that connected communities, washed away. Entire populations caught without warning or preparation, swept away by water that came too fast to outrun. The tablets described the human cost with unusual pathos for ancient literature. The Atrahasis Epic records the goddess Nintu, who had helped create humanity, weeping as she watched the destruction. The gods sat there weeping with her. Her lips were covered with feverishness. My offspring have become like flies. The Anunnaki wept with her. The gods, in their places, wept. Their lips were parched with thirst. This is remarkable. The same gods who authorized the flood were now traumatized by its execution. Nintu mourned the humans she had birthed like a mother mourning children. Even the Divine Council, having voted for genocide, was horrified by what genocide actually looked like. The water rose until it covered everything. The Gilgamesh account states that even the gods could not see the earth. All of mankind had returned to clay. The surface of the water was like a flat roof. Everything had been leveled. Mountains submerged. Highlands drowned. No land visible anywhere. Just endless water under a grey sky. Archaeological evidence suggests this wasn't purely mythological. Core samples from the Persian Gulf show evidence of massive freshwater discharge around 3,000 years before the Common Era. Something caused enormous volumes of river water to flood into the Gulf. Whether from glacial melt, catastrophic rainfall, or both, the geological record confirms unusual flooding during the period these texts describe. Inside the sealed boat, Ziusudra and his family endured. They had no way to measure time, no way to know if the waters were rising or falling, no way to know if they were drifting toward safety or toward destruction. They simply waited in darkness, trusting Enki's design, hoping the structure would hold. The animals, stressed and confined, would have required constant care, feeding them, cleaning waste, preventing panic, keeping predator species separated from prey. The logistics alone would have been overwhelming for a small crew managing hundreds of species in a dark, pitching vessel. On the seventh day, according to the text, the storm subsided. The waters that had been turbulent grew calm. The wind stopped. And slowly, gradually, the boat came to rest. Not in the water, but on solid ground. It had grounded on a mountain. The Sumerian text doesn't name the mountain. The Akkadian version calls it Mount Naimush. The biblical account would later call it, but all versions agree the boat came to rest on high ground that had remained above the flood level, or that emerged first as waters receded. Ziusudra waited. He couldn't immediately emerge. The text describes him opening a window. Light flooded in after 7 days of darkness. He looked out and saw water still covering everything, but the level was dropping. He could see the peak of the mountain where the boat rested. The Gilgamesh version describes him sending out birds to test if land had reappeared. First a dove, which found nowhere to land and returned. Then a swallow, same result. Finally, a raven, which found land and didn't return. This meant somewhere exposed earth existed again. When Ziusudra finally opened the door and emerged, the world he stepped into was unrecognizable. Not the world he'd left 7 days earlier. That world was gone, buried under layers of silt. Every city he'd known, destroyed. Every person he'd known, except those in the boat with him, dead. The landscape was empty, silent, no birds singing, no insects buzzing, no human voices, just wind moving over mud and water. The first thing Ziusudra did, according to every version of the text, was offer sacrifice. He built an altar on the mountaintop. He slaughtered animals from the boat and burned them as offerings to the gods. The smoke rose into the sky, and the gods, who had been hiding in the heaven of Anu, smelled the sacrifice. The Atrahasis Epic describes this with almost comedic detail. The gods smelled the savor. The gods smelled the sweet savor. The gods gathered like flies over the offering. Why were the gods so drawn to this sacrifice? Because they'd been without offerings for 7 days. In Mesopotamian theology, gods required sustenance from human worship. Offerings of food, drink, and incense maintained them. During the flood, with all humanity destroyed, the gods had received nothing. They were, in a very real sense, hungry. Ziusudra's sacrifice was the first food they'd received since the catastrophe began, and their desperate gathering round it revealed just how dependent they were on the humans they'd nearly wiped out. Enlil arrived to inspect the cleansed earth, and then he saw the boat. He saw the survivors, and according to the text, he was furious. The Atrahasis Epic records his outburst. Has any of the people escaped? No man was to survive the destruction. He looked for the one responsible. Who could have done this except Enki? Only Enki had the knowledge and access to subvert the plan. What followed was a confrontation at the highest level of divine authority. Enki didn't deny what he'd done. Instead, he argued. He pointed out that the decision to destroy all humanity had been excessive, that the noise problem could have been solved through other means. The text preserves his suggestions. Impose birth control. Let there be women who bear and women who don't bear. Establish categories of priestesses who are forbidden to bear children. Let the child snatcher snatch infants. This sounds harsh to modern ears, but in context, Enki was proposing population management instead of extermination, targeted measures instead of genocide. The divine council, perhaps sobered by actually witnessing the horror they'd authorized, agreed to the compromise. Humanity would be allowed to continue, but under new terms. Natural limits would keep populations from growing beyond sustainable levels. Disease, predation, infant mortality, infertility, these wouldn't be punishments, but regulatory mechanisms preventing the population explosion that had triggered the flood decision in the first place. But there was also reward. Ziusudra, who had survived through obedience and wisdom, was granted something extraordinary. The texts vary on details, but all agree he received special status. The Sumerian version says he was given eternal life and taken to Dilmun, a paradise land. The Akkadian version describes him being elevated to a status like the gods, living forever at the mouth of the rivers where fresh and salt water meet. He became a bridge between the world before the flood and the world after, the last witness to what had been lost, and what had been lost was everything. When Ziusudra and his family finally descended from the mountain and returned to the lowlands, they found no cities standing, no temples, no palaces. Shuruppak, where Ziusudra had been king, was buried under meters of silt. Excavations at the site in the 1920s confirmed this. There's a distinct flood layer at Shuruppak, dated to around 2,900 years before the Common Era. Below that layer are remains of a sophisticated urban center. Above it, everything had to be rebuilt from scratch. The survivors faced an impossible task. They were the only humans left, according to the mythology, though the reality was probably more complex. Likely, there were other survivors in highland regions the flood hadn't reached. But the urban centers, the seats of knowledge and administration, were gone. The irrigation systems destroyed. The seed grains stored in city granaries rotted underwater. The libraries where astronomical observations had been recorded for thousands of years, dissolved into mud. What could be salvaged? Memory, skills, knowledge that had been carried in minds rather than written in texts. The craftsmen who'd been brought aboard the boat could teach their trades to the next generation. The farmers knew planting cycles. The astronomers knew star patterns. The priests knew rituals. But the institutional continuity was broken. The unbroken chains of observation and record-keeping that had stretched back through impossible spans of time. Those were severed. This is why Sumerian texts consistently describe their knowledge as restoration rather than invention. They weren't creating civilization. They were rebuilding it from fragments of what had existed before the flood. The Sumerian king list documents this transition. Before the flood, impossibly long reigns measured in shars, suggesting institutional rather than individual time spans. After the flood, human scale reigns. The system had changed. direct divine rule had ended. What came after was fundamentally different. The flood itself appears in the archaeological record exactly where the texts say it should. At Ur, Leonard Woolley found 8 feet of sterile clay between occupation layers. At Shuruppak, excavators found the same pattern. At Kish, at Eridu, across southern Mesopotamia, the geological testimony matches the literary testimony. Water came, cities drowned, civilization ended, and then, slowly, painfully, it began again, but it began differently. The post-flood world described in the texts lacks something the pre-flood world had. The gods are more distant, less directly involved. They no longer walk among humans in quite the same way. Kingship is lowered from heaven again, but the kings are clearly mortal. They die after decades, or perhaps a century or two, in legendary accounts, but nothing approaching the timeless quality of pre-flood rulers. What happened during those 7 days changed more than geography. It changed the fundamental relationship between divine and human, between knowledge holders and knowledge seekers, between the world that had been and the world that would be built atop its ruins. The flood wasn't just water. It was reset, the dividing line between ages, the catastrophe that ended one era and forced the beginning of another. Some scholars read this as pure mythology, a story explaining why life is hard, why we're mortal, why the gods feel distant. Others read it as encoded wisdom about population management and ecological limits. But there's a third reading. What if the texts preserve memory of actual catastrophe? Not necessarily global, but devastating enough within Mesopotamian experience that it felt global. Not necessarily caused by divine decision, but so overwhelming that survivors could only explain it as divine judgment. The details are too specific to be pure invention. 7 days of inundation. Waters rising from below and falling from above. A boat designed with particular dimensions. A mountain landfall. Bird reconnaissance. The first sacrifice after catastrophe. These read like someone documenting what actually happened. Even if the theological framework attributes agency to gods rather than natural forces. And there's the question the texts keep asking without directly stating it. Why did Enki save Ziusudra? The standard answer is that Enki valued humanity and opposed genocide. But there might be more. What if Ziusudra carried something besides just his family aboard that boat? What if he carried knowledge, astronomical tables, mathematical tablets, medical texts, agricultural records, the accumulated wisdom of the civilization that was about to drown? What if the boat was both ark and archive, preserving not just biological survival but cultural continuity? This would explain why Sumerian civilization appears so suddenly with such sophistication after the flood. They weren't starting from zero. They were working from salvage, fragments rescued from the waters, knowledge carried aboard a boat during 7 days of darkness while the world drowned. And when they emerged onto a mountain and eventually descended to rebuild in the valleys, they brought with them pieces of what had been. Not everything, not the complete institutional memory, but enough to rebuild recognizably, to restore rather than reinvent. The texts were copied for thousands of years after the events they describe. Sumerian scribes in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era studied them. Babylonian scholars in the 2nd millennium copied them. Assyrian libraries in the 1st millennium preserved them. When Hormuzd-Razam excavated K 3375 from the ruins of Nineveh, he was recovering a copy that had been made in the 7th. century before the Common Era, from sources that stretched back another 1500 years to the original Sumerian accounts. Why preserve this story so carefully for so long? Because it mattered. Because the memory of what happened during those 7 days when the world drowned was considered essential knowledge. A warning. A reminder. A testimony that catastrophe wasn't theoretical but historical. That the world could end, had ended, and that survival required wisdom, preparation, and the willingness to preserve what matters when everything else is lost. In museums across the world, the flood tablets wait in their climate-controlled storage. The wedge marks pressed into clay by scribes who believed they were documenting truth, not inventing mythology, but preserving memory. Memory of 7 days when cities vanished beneath water, when the gods themselves cowered in terror at what they'd unleashed, when one family in one boat became the bridge between the world that was and the world that would be. The question isn't whether a flood happened. The geological evidence confirms catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia around the time these texts describe. The question is what the flood meant. Was it natural disaster explained through theological framework? Was it encoded teaching about limits and consequences? Or was it something else, something the survivors tried desperately to document accurately because they knew future generations needed to understand what could happen when the waters came? The texts don't answer definitively. They simply describe 7 days, waters above and waters below, a boat, a mountain, a sacrifice, and then silence. The silence after catastrophe, the silence before rebuilding, the silence that asks every generation that reads these tablets whether we've learned what the flood was meant to teach. Somewhere in the darkness, where you're listening now, rain might be falling, water moving across the earth the way it always has, the way it did during those 7 days when it moved too much and covered everything. The difference between rain and flood is only a matter of degree. The difference between sustaining life and drowning it is only a matter of measure, and the text suggests that measure can be exceeded, has been exceeded, could be exceeded again. The survivors knew this. Ziusudra carried this knowledge forward. The Sumerians preserved it in clay. The Babylonians copied it faithfully. The Assyrians archived it carefully. And now we read it thousands of years later and ask what they were trying so desperately to tell us. What happened during the flood isn't just ancient history. It's warning. It's testimony. It's the memory of the generation that watched their world drown and emerged to find everything they'd known erased beneath silt and silence. Sleep now, if you can, and let the mystery remain. Let the clay remember for you. Let the story of 7 days when the world ended carry forward as it has for 5,000 years, because some memories are too important to lose. Some warnings are too vital to forget, and some testimonies, pressed into clay and fired hard against time, deserve to be heard by every generation that follows, not because we fully understand them, but because somewhere in the darkness, in the details of 7 days beneath water, might be truth we desperately need to hear. Truth about limits, about consequences, about what happens when the balance breaks and the waters come and everything we've built vanishes beneath the flood.